There's a new buzz phrase that feminists are using, which you should be aware of if you're not aware of already. Here's a few headlines. We need to talk about women's unpaid emotional labour, and urgently! Urgently! I don't know why it's so urgent. So is this something that's just happened then? And what is going to be the disastrous thing that's going to occur if it doesn't get talked about? It's urgent! Anyway, keep going. Yeah, that one. 8 lessons that show how emotional labour defines women's lives. Includes the being asked to smile by strangers. I've got an amusing anecdote about this, because the first I ever heard of this, it was a feminist. Came into the staff room at that place where I was working, and she said she can't stand it when people ask her to smile. And I said, yeah, that really annoys me too. If you're feeling depressed, something worse than going, oh, cheer up, mate, it ain't never happened. She said, oh, I didn't realise that happened to men. I thought it just happened to women. No, I think it happens to anyone who looks like they're introverted. Why that is amusing is that I witnessed exactly the same conversation occur at another workplace, in another staff room, except I wasn't the man that time. It was another man. The same thing played out. The girl came in and complained about people telling her to smile, and then the guy said, yeah, I hate that too. They think this only happens to women. Okay, keep moving. Right, so you might be wondering what they're talking about, and you might be inclined at first to go, no, that's not a thing. Actually, it's not even that new. It's from 1984. And originally in 1984, when it was first talked about, it was referring to workplace emotional labour. And it basically meant that those sort of jobs where you have to be inauthentic in your emotions as part of the job. So, for example, if you work at McDonald's, you have to say, have a nice day now, as you hand over the burger, and things like that. I know a little coffee shop in Waterloo where they don't expect any emotional labour of the staff at all. The staff are very authentic in how pissed off they are at working there. You've got to be friendly if you're bar staff, for example. Another term that's used is emotional regulation. Okay, emotional regulation. Now you might be starting to think, hold on. They've taken about the only thing they admitted there was an inequality that affected men and made it inequality that affects them. Isn't the whole thing about boys don't cry supposed to be how men are disadvantaged in society? And now they're making regulating one's emotions a female thing. Now I have to say, actually, there is some truth in it that women do seem to at least take it upon themselves to be inauthentic in their emotions in the way that men don't. And I find this actually quite frustrating. I've had female companions, I suppose, in one sense or another, whether they were friends or partners, who have been really interesting, deep, complex, fascinating people to speak to individually, and then they get into a group situation and they suddenly turn into the most shallow and artificial creations, saying, oh my god, it's so lovely to see you, to people they don't really give a shit about. And I do have to say, why do you do that? It just makes you so much less attractive than the person that I'm used to dealing with. There are 4 claims being made by the feminists regarding emotional labour that I'm going to be dealing with here. Firstly, that it is unpaid. Well, there must be some sort of incentivization to do it, otherwise why would you be doing it? I mean, no one actually likes people that are emotionally inauthentic, so there must be some sort of incentivization going on. What are those incentives? That's the first thing I'm going to look into. Secondly, that it is predominantly women that do this, and I have admittedly I've conceded a little bit to that point already, because I've said that there are a lot of social situations which women do tend to be the gender that is more emotionally inauthentic. But now I'm going to retract that concedation, if concedation is the word for a conceding of a thing, and state that no, male stoicism is clearly a form of emotional regulation, including the fact that we have to restrain anger It's always assumed when people are talking about men restraining their emotions, it's always said that we're permitted to be angry. On the contrary, we're not permitted to be angry. Anger is very much disapproved of in men because when we're angry, we're scary. It could well be that if men seem to be the angrier gender, it's because we've got more to be angry about. I certainly know more men that punch walls than punch people. They're not punching walls for their own benefit. They're punching walls because they've refrained from exhibiting anger in other situations in which it was socially inappropriate. Thirdly, regarding professional emotional labour, it is suggested that they are the industries that are predominantly female. That's the third claim I'm going to be dealing with. So that's going to be moving into what we're going to call professional emotional labour, which is the emotional labour that was originally being talked about by Hochschild. And fourthly, that it is because we undervalue emotional labour contributes to the gender wage gap. Those are the four claims that are being made. I'm not going to go any huge thing debunking gender wage gap. It's been done, hasn't it? Everyone's done that at some point. Just because it's unpaid in monetary terms does not mean it's unpaid in terms of advantage, and that goes for both sexes. Both sexes are sometimes inauthentic in their emotions, and they get some benefit as a result. First thing to query is, if you can whittle down what emotional labour is some sort of white lie emoting. That is, emoting inauthentically because it just makes life easier, doesn't it? Why is that commendable anyway? Why is it commendable to be an inauthentic human being? I don't actually even want to compete on this. I might want to say, yeah, that's true. Women are less sincere about their emotions. However, I'm not going to say that. That would be a very misogynistic thing to say, and I don't do that sort of thing. There's no misogyny in MGTOW, as we know. Anyway, so if you're talking about unpaid emotional labour, you are talking about emotional labour that is done for a benefit that is not monetary, a non-financial benefit. You get a non-financial benefit from behaving in a emotionally inauthentic way. So you're going to have to look for what the other benefits are. Your benefits may be that it's a social lubricant. It may be that it elevates your status. It may be that it makes your relationship more secure and you get benefits from your relationship that make that worthwhile. And it could be seeking somebody else's approval. You would only really have an excuse to say that it was unfair if the benefit was escaping a punishment of some sort. Whether escaping a punishment of some sort is a physical punishment, whether the punishment is disapproval or a complaint. PUAs, good examples of men that are inauthentic emotionally. Emotionally inauthentic. Prime example, negging is a form of inauthentic emoting, isn't it? Because negging is the idea that you disparage the one you find attractive. The person you find attractive, you're going to be most disparaging to them. So that's inauthentic emoting, right? Because what you'd like to do is say, my God, you're beautiful, I desire you so much, but instead you're saying things like, I don't know, I don't know that much about negging. I'm going to have to look up some negging. Never having followed any PUA content, I don't really know exactly what negging is, so I'm looking at some now. So effectively, there's some suggestions here, like you say to her male friends, so what's special about this one? Which is supposed to make her feel like, but she's being talked about like she's not there, I guess. I get it. The idea is that you're saying, oh, I'm too good for you, and therefore you're raising your status. That's the idea. You're not special, and I am good enough to consider you to be not special. I like that outfit you've got on, but I don't know, shoes don't really match. You should have gone with tan boots. That says that I have I have a really specific obsession with female fashion that was just I'm some sort of closet vicarious transvestite. I think. What's it supposed to say? I don't know. Your roots are showing. I don't know. Basically, negging is there's somebody that you would like to be complimenting because you really find them quite attractive, but you've decided that it will make you more attractive if rather than telling them they're attractive, you actually make them feel more insecure. But nevertheless, negging has been inauthentic. Therefore, negging is a form of emotional labour, isn't it? Putting aside negging, which is, I suppose, kind of psychologically manipulative form of chatting somebody up, even the more normal forms of chatting somebody up that involve perhaps less psychological manipulation involve some sort of emotional inauthenticity. Confidence is something that one sort of fakes when one is chatting somebody up, and bragging is a form of emotional inauthenticity. It's pretend that one is a massive success, despite the fact that we all know that none of us are a massive success. We all have our pros and cons, accentuating the positive, eliminating the negative. When you try to present yourself as a saleable item on the sexual marketplace. Sexual marketplace being a very, very PUA term. But the PUAs can't claim that their emotional labour is unpaid, or at least it is sometimes unpaid. It's frequently unpaid. It's a gamble, right? They gamble their emotional labour. They stick their emotional labour on the roulette table of the dating scene and see if it pays out. Furthermore, this is a good example of how no one really appreciates inauthenticity. It's not a good thing. It's one of the charges levelled at men is that they're inauthentic when they chat women up, exaggerate emotions they don't really have. In fact, I would say the challenge of the more traditional wooing is trying to convince the other person that the emotions you're expressing are authentic. Which is why we used to do things like write poetry, didn't we? And make compilation tapes of songs that would make you think about her, stuff like that. It's only a labour if you've been inauthentic. So don't be inauthentic. And then you can't complain. Well, you can complain. You say, oh, I'm heartbroken. But then it's not a labour. If you've been authentic, it's not labour. So then it's not such a hardship when it doesn't get paid. The PUAs and the inauthentic girls that go, oh my god, that dress looks fabulous. Oh, I haven't seen you for ages. Oh god, I love you so much. You know, oh, you're the best. Yeah. So they're female friends. They're both being inauthentic emotionally. And you know what? They're being inauthentic emotionally for the same group. I'd be hard pressed to claim, as Everyday Feminism does, that emotional labour is performed usually for men. And certainly in the social group setting, it's usually performed for other women. One of the examples given of emotional labour that normally falls to women is being a sympathetic ear. It tends to be women doing it for other women. And in fact, it's an emotional labour that is more likely to be demanded by women from acquaintances of both genders than it is to be demanded by a man. So looking at how it kind of intersects in terms of the sympathetic ear form of emotional labour, where one is saying, oh, I've got to pretend I care. Firstly, if you're saying I've got to pretend I care, that means you don't care. You're kind of admitting you're a heartless human being there, really. You're not actually generating much sympathy for me if you say, oh, it's so awful, I have to pretend I care. Well, how about caring? That will save you that labour. If you actually care, you won't have to pretend to care. But emotional is, let's amalgamate the genuine caring and the pretending to care. it tends to be something that women may do for both women and men do predominantly for women. So if there is an inequality there, actually it's one that's in our hands, but it's an inequality that disadvantages men, but it is in our hands. Yes, men aren't that good at giving sympathetic ear to other men, and possibly that's because we're in competition with each other, or see each other as competition. Partly that might be to do with the fact that we don't want to appear weak in front of other men, and feel uncomfortable with a man who is admitting to us that he's weak. Having said that, a contributory factor in men not giving each other sympathetic ears is surely the one good man syndrome that we're indoctrinated into by growing up in a feminist society. I tell you who complains about unpaid emotional labour. You know who complains about unpaid emotional labour? It's this. It's the Straw MRA. The Straw MRA, who's really a male feminist, a disgruntled male feminist that a feminist has decided is an MRA because he's disgruntled. The one who says, "But I'm a nice guy, and the guys don't want to sleep with me, but I do listen to all their problems." Yeah, you listen to all their problems, so you're giving emotional labour, and now you're complaining you're not getting paid for your emotional labour. Well, there's no difference really. There's no difference in these feminists now complaining that their emotional labour is being unpaid, and that guy, but I'm a nice guy, that guy. Right. So firstly, what I've decided is emotional labour is rather manipulative, isn't it? I mean, the whole idea of emotional labour is I'm going to fake my emotions. Secondly, I'm either getting a benefit from it or I'm hoping to get a benefit from it. Or I'm trying to avoid a punishment for it. Now, of those groups, the one that we might want to be concerned with is those that are avoiding a punishment for it. Okay? I don't really care about those that are getting some benefit from it or hoping to get some benefit from it. They both seem deeply manipulative people to me, so I don't really care about them. And in fact, if they're complaining about it, you know what? The solution lies with you. Okay? You could just be authentic instead, couldn't you? The one group that maybe I have some sympathy for are those that are trying to avoid a punishment. And of course, one of the punishments that men are often avoiding is female disapproval. And that's why I'm a Zeta male. In fact, what makes a Zeta male, which is a class of male of which Migto is a subset, more authentic human beings than your betas or alphas, is that we have consciously devalued the currency of female approval. Therefore, female approval is no longer an incentive to be inauthentic emotionally in any way whatsoever. And loss of it holds no terrors. As I've established, I don't really care about anyone who is performing emotional labour to get a benefit or in hopes of getting a benefit. The only people that I would have sympathy for are those who are performing emotional labour to avoid a punishment of some sort. So let's establish whether that group is predominantly female or predominantly male. Okay, let's have a look at some of these articles. This is from the Independent. The Independent's headline was, "We need to talk about women's unpaid emotional labour, and urgently." This was the urgent one. This is kind of changing the definition of emotional labour to something else, really. She's a bit cheeky. So she says, "I remember the moment I genuinely felt oppressed as a woman in the home." The moment she genuinely felt oppressed. This is a feminist. She's claiming this is the moment she genuinely felt oppressed. So what was the rest of the time? The rest of the time she was just, "Oh yeah, I'm so oppressed. Not really. Oh, I've just felt genuinely oppressed. First time. Feminist. The rest of the time I was faking it. Anyway. Oh, the emotional labour of having to pretend to be oppressed. Feminist work is never done. Perhaps I'm reading too much into that one sentence. Anyway. It was shortly after I became a mother for the first time. Exhausted and struggling with postnatal depression, it was my job not just to nurture and care for our son, but also inexplicably, to find a childminder, book his immunisations, take him to the doctor, and plan his meals. I'm going to avoid pointing out the grammatical error that makes it sound like she's booking the immunisations to the childminder and taking the childminder to the doctor and planning the childminder's meals. That's what it sounds like. But, never mind. That's clearly not what she meant. Inexplicably, though, I'd like to pick up on that. Inexplicably, I don't think it's that inexplicable. Your husband's gone back to work, right? That's why it's falling to you, because your husband's gone back to work. Okay, well, perhaps we need paternity leave. That could be something that you could work on. We could all work on that. I think that is one of those areas of what we call common ground that we could both be working on. Paternity leave for men that is equal to maternity leave for women. And then it wouldn't be inexplicably falling to you. I knew the distribution of these tasks was unfairly piled on me, but questioned myself. Was I just being silly, overreacting? Should I just be getting on with it? As with many issues, once we find a way to articulate what's happening, to express it and give it a name, it becomes easier to address and expose it. How liberating then to know that all this extra work that seems to belong to me merely because I'm a woman now has the recognised label of emotional labour. Only because you've redefined emotional labour. You've redefined emotional labour now to be organisational skills. Organisational skills isn't emotional labour, it's organisational skills. There's nothing emotional about what we've described. You did not have to do anything that was inauthentically emotional to, well, maybe to nurture and care for your son. If you've been in postnatal depression and you're not actually attached to your son, you need to pretend that you're attached to your son in order to give him a healthy childhood, I guess. That could involve some sort of inauthentic emotion. No inauthentic emotion is required to find a childminder. No inauthentic emotion is required to book his immunisations, or to take him to the doctor, or plan his meals. You're not talking about emotional labour, you're talking about organisational skills. You've actually changed the definition of emotional labour in order to classify these things as emotional labour. They're not emotional labour. So I'm going to put that to one side, because they're changing the freaking subject. Let's have a look at some of the others. Everyday Feminism is a little bit closer to sticking to the definition of emotional labour. Journalist for the Independent doesn't actually seem to know what emotional labour is. Okay, so she says that when she was 4 years old, her grandfather wants to hug and kiss her, and she doesn't really want to be hugged and kissed. And her family urges her to just let it happen because it makes the grandfather feel better. Yeah, I had that with aunts. This is not a gendered thing. A lot of children have this with older relatives. And I'm surprised it's your grandfather, because usually it is female relatives that feel that they need to have a chance to hold the baby. They want the hugs and kisses and things like that. They get offended or mimic being offended if they don't get a hug and a kiss from the children when they see them. So I'm a little surprised that it's a grandfather there, although I'm not disputing that it's a grandfather. But that role of being the older relative that demands demonstrative affection from the children is not usually a male. Actually, there is something to say here. Because it's a male relative, she makes it sound a lot creepier. I don't think it's seen as creepy when female relatives do that. I think it's almost seen as normal. I don't know if it should be seen as creepy. Maybe it should be seen as creepy, but it isn't. Obviously, to come back to my maxim, identifying a double standard does not inform us what the universal standard should be. But there does seem to be a sort of inequality that male relative demanding affection from children would be seen as creepier than a female relative demanding affection from children. I have to say, whether you're male or female, you're the adult, and you shouldn't be the one that's demanding. You're not the one who is affection needing. They're children, they are affection needing. And if they don't want affection from you, then you have to grow up. And I would say that to her grandfather, or the many, many aunts in the world that do the same thing. There is something more to be said about the grandfather one. She says that she gets disapproval from the family for resisting her grandfather's affection. She gets told that she's ungrateful. So that is a form of emotional labour which has got a punishment. I do actually feel sympathy for her. I've expressed the sympathy I feel for her. However, I do think it's got less to do with being a woman and more to do with the fact that she was a child. And I think that many male children go through exactly the same experience. My next one, 10 years old. Love means never saying anything. My father never talks to anyone about his feelings, except for me, that is. Yeah, that's lovely, isn't it? Oh. On long drives when we were alone in the car, he rolls down the window and turns up the radio, always the oldies stations that plays the Beatles and the Beach Boys and Joni Mitchell in endless loops, and talks to me about everything. What it was like growing up Chinese in small town Canada in the 1950s, how hard it was working in restaurants his whole life from the age of 6. Family secrets like who owes whom money, who had an abortion or a miscarriage, and which relatives spent years in a psychiatric institution. Troubles in my parents' marriage, our family's financial problems. My father doesn't ask me what I think about these things or if I understand them. I don't mind. I know that my job is just to listen, to nod, to hold the weight of these adult things for my father, if only for a little while. It makes me feel special listening to these things. So you're getting a benefit. That's nice. Okay, so it's not unpaid, is it? It's not unpaid. It makes you feel special. Making you feel special is the payment. Even though I sometimes worry about them for weeks afterwards, or have nightmares. This is quite interesting, actually. As this story progresses, this is kind of part of the etiology of what turns out to be a Florence Nightingale complex. Now, there is something about her father's tragedy here. The only person that her father feels that he can talk to is his 10-year-old daughter. There's no one else who can offer him a sympathetic ear apart from his 10-year-old daughter. Nevertheless, his 10-year-old daughter then develops a sort of dependency on being the repository of other people's pain, as it were. So there's obviously the two sympathetic characters here. She's a very sympathetic character, the father's a very sympathetic character. In fact, the father has kind of performed a form of psychological abuse inadvertently, although I don't think he did it deliberately. But he has. What this made me think about was male feminists, actually. I was thinking about how these situations where a boy has the mother as a primary caregiver and the father is either absent because it's a single parent situation, or he's absent because he's engaged in labour elsewhere. And he becomes the repository of her pain because he's the one that she can talk to. That may be part of the etiology of the male feminist. I'm not going to continue with the Everyday Feminism one because I'm just going to, it goes on and on and on. But basically, this is the start of it. So she's saying that when she was about 10 years old, she used to listen to her father. His father used to tell her the problems, and that she got a reward from that. It made her feel loved, made her feel special. But it also put a burden upon her. She had a burden of taking on his troubles. She took on his troubles, and it made her feel burdened. Now, that continues through her life. So she starts talking about a friend of hers when she's 14 that talks about herself being raped. She talks about a boyfriend she had when she was 17 who committed suicide, or attempted suicide rather, because he felt terribly guilty about a girlfriend that he'd lost his temper with and hurt. And she winds up going into the caring industry. She ends up going into social work as a result. Sounds like what she's got is a Florence Nightingale complex. I'm also identifying with the story a little bit as well, because in some ways, you know, I've just done that video, Memoirs of a Mangina, in which I talk about how feminism left me with a certain paranoia, because I did listen to an awful lot of women talking about their traumas, and traumas involving men rape, heavy burden, especially as at the same time I was getting feminists telling me that you could accidentally rape somebody by not getting affirmative consent, affirmative enthusiastic consent, and not being aware that some women are conditioned to not be able to say no, and all that sort of nonsense. That made me very, very paranoid, and I did feel like I was taking on a great burden. Taking on the burdens of other people's emotions is not specifically a female thing. It is a thing that belongs to a certain personality type. That when it's in women, it's called the Florence Nightingale complex, and when it's in men, it's called the white knight complex. It's not entirely connected to white knight in terms of the way we kind of use it in the MRM to refer to male feminists and certain traditionalist men as well as white knights. Any man who will defend a woman whether she's right or wrong because she's a woman, or after events because she's a woman. But the Florence Nightingales and white knights in terms of these syndromes are people that are attracted specifically to people that they feel need their help. And it's almost like they have a need to be needed. So the blogger in Everyday Feminism is using the term emotional labour legitimately. And she's also kind of confessing to a sort of an addiction to being the caring role. And that addiction to playing the caring role is creating a great burden upon her, and drives to what we would call compassion fatigue. And I do have sympathy for her, actually, but I don't think it's gendered. Yeah, one of the ones that she talks about right at the end of the Everyday Feminism article is she listens to her boyfriend talk about all his problems at work, and then he's not particularly interested in hearing about hers. Well, I'm sorry, that's a situation on which there is a gender reversal many, many times. You know, it's often women that demand that you listen to their problems. It's quite uncommon for men to be demanding you listen to their problems in the same way. In fact, it's normally the complaint that we don't talk about them. She's complaining about her boyfriend doing the thing that other women are complaining that men don't do. Actually, it makes me think a little bit about victim feminism and how victim feminism attracts two specific types of people. There's two people, right? There's the ones that actually want to play the victim, and there's those that have the Florence Nightingale complexes and the white knight complexes, and just are easily manipulated by people who play victim, because they need to be needed. They have an insecurity in themselves, a feeling of low self-worth, and that they need to compensate for by performing emotional labour for those who are victims. And I think she falls into that category. But so do most male feminists. That's one of the reasons that male feminists are easily indoctrinated into the cult. Okay, so there is one more anecdote that didn't fit into the story that I kind of praised there. When she's 16 years old, she attempts suicide, and then she feels terribly selfish after attempting suicide. Then she feels she has to live for her parents' sake. I don't have to point out that suicide is 4 times as common for men as it is for women. Some people do see that as selfish. I've seen that said about the male suicide rate as well. I've even seen it said that that is why the male suicide rate is higher, is because men are more selfish. The interesting thing about the suicide anecdote is she's talking now about concealing emotions, and that emotional labour of concealing emotions. This is where you start to think, well, now you're verging on an area which is exclusively assumed to be male, whilst having to portray emotions inauthentically is perhaps something that is expected of females. something that's expected from males more commonly, I think, is to conceal emotions to keep everyone else comfortable. That whole thing of if a man expresses his emotions of attraction, then that may be perceived as making somebody else feel uncomfortable or make him seem creepy. So he's concealing those emotions because he's concerned about the emotional effect of somebody else. And feminism itself is this whole industry based on not making women feel uncomfortable. That making women feel uncomfortable is a terrible thing. That requires the men to conceal their emotions. But the emotional labour of the tiny acts of domestic heroism, like the spider in the bathroom and the noise downstairs. There's a noise downstairs. Will you go down and check that out for me? He's got to be the one that goes down and checks that out. So there's an emotional labour there. He has to conceal his fear, or he has to act in defiance of his own fear. So courage is a form of emotional labour. As I said before, concealing one's anger is a form of emotional labour. Restraining one's anger so that one doesn't frighten anyone is a form of emotional labour. And the thing about these forms of emotional labour I'm talking about is they're not done for a reward. They're done to avoid punishment. They're done to avoid social disapproval. Possibly the acting brave is done for a reward, I suppose. I suppose he might win the affection of his loved one by performing a brave act. But the others, like concealing your emotions about somebody, concealing your attraction, that's done to avoid the punishment of being seen as creepy, right? The one about restraining your anger is done to avoid being accused of abuse or to avoid being demonized. Concealing one's insecurities are to avoid being seen as weak. Loss of female approval is one of the punishments that sort of Zeta male has managed to make into no longer a punishment by consciously taking currency away from female approval. So since we hold female approval to have no currency, therefore losing it is not a punishment anymore, which allows us to behave more authentically as a result. Okay. So whilst the feminist journalist who's writing for The Independent doesn't seem to know what emotional labour is, and she's completely misidentified it as, I think, labour she gets emotional payment for rather than emotional labour, I think she doesn't really understand what the term is. One writing for Everyday Feminism does seem to understand what emotional labour is. At least two, I suppose she's talking about, are what I would say is definitely emotional labour. Showing affection to the grandfather and the concealing one's emotions so as not to worry the parents who are concerned about the fact she's attempted suicide. They're two definite emotional labours. The rest she's talking about is really compassion fatigue. And I suppose it didn't begin as emotional labour, it began as genuine caring, and over time it has become emotional labour as she has become compassion fatigued. Because once you're compassion fatigued, you have to be pretending to be compassionate rather than actually being compassionate. I have some sympathy there. She's still getting payment, but she's getting payment in the form of a sense of self-worth that she has developed a dependency on. So it's like she's been paid in a drug she's addicted to, as it were. There's a codependency between people with those sort of complexes, Florence Nightingale complexes and White Knight complexes, and people who play victim. Very susceptible people, but it is a kind of a mutually vampiric relationship. So while she has my sympathy, the problem lies in her It doesn't lie in her gender, because both males and females can suffer from that problem. And that's probably the reason why she's wound up sucked into the cult of feminism as well. Because feminism chews up people like you, Kai Cheng. When you start talking about concealing emotions, suppressing emotions, regulating emotions as forms of emotional labour, then I think it starts to look like the lion's share might belong to men. Because it's men who suppress their emotions to make sure everyone else feels comfortable around them. Women's emotions trump men's emotions. It's women whose feelings everyone has to protect. I felt that while there may be some disproportion between the genders on who does emotional labour, I felt there is a bigger disproportion in who emotional labour is done for. After all, one of them, for example, is somebody could say to you, does this dress make me look fat? And you have to pretend that it doesn't, or restrain yourself and say, hey, it's not the dress, honey. So, we have to protect women's feelings. Because we have to protect women's feelings, that there is a lot of emotional labour revolving around protecting women's feelings. Whilst that doesn't gender emotional labour particularly, because both men and women have to protect women's feelings, it does mean the recipients of emotional labour are predominantly female. Feminism picks some funny battles to fight, doesn't it? If you stuck to the definition of what emotional labour was, and they don't, you'd think that being the recipient of inauthentic emoting would actually be a greater hardship than having to be the ones doing the inauthentic emoting. Because inauthentic emoting is basically lying in some degree or other. Admittedly, sometimes it's lying because you have to, because of your social expectations. Nevertheless, it is lying, and surely it's worse to be lied to than having to do lying. Surely. And as women are, I think, predominantly the recipients of emotional labour, yeah, I think it's true. I think people are more inauthentic towards women than they are towards men. I think it is one of the, I'm going to check my privilege here, I think it is one of the privileges of being a man, is people generally are honest about how they feel about you. Whereas if you're a woman, you might be thinking, yeah, you say that, but do you really mean it? That's what I would complain about if I was a woman, was people not being honest to me. Actually, I do know women that don't like the company of other women for that very reason, because they say, I don't trust them to be sincere in the way I trust men to be sincere. Right, so the next claim is that emotional labour, when it's paid emotional labour, is predominantly female. At the time Hofschild was writing, this seemed to be the case because she was talking predominantly about people in the service industry, people who give service with smiles. So you're talking about your waitresses and your air stewardesses and teachers and nurses and so on. Anyone with a sort of public face, really. Anyone has to deal with the public first-hand, managers in complaints offices and all that sort of thing. Now, the service industry isn't exclusively female, obviously, it isn't exclusively female. It's saying that probably there are more women working in service with smile type jobs. Anyone working in the public has to put on their public face. And there has been, however, a follow-up book, not by Hofschild, but by Marion Isaac White, called Leadership as Emotional Labour. Actually, that suddenly gets you thinking, doesn't it? Because you think, oh yeah, actually, yeah, a manager, he or she has emotional labour of sorts as well. I knew a guy who was a manager, quite a close friend, and actually I deeply respect him. He's talking more about management than most people in middle management. Most people in middle management put pressure down, and he was always very good at putting pressure both ways. He realised that part of his job as a middle manager was actually to listen to the workers and put pressure on the employer when the employer was delivering the workers a poor deal. And I don't think most middle managers don't realise that. They don't stand up to the management above them as an advocate for the people below them. They just do it the other way. Just act as an advocate for the management above them and put pressure downward. He was always prepared to put pressure both ways, and I think that's what made him a very good middle manager. But he found it a terrible stress because it is putting on a public face, of course. It can't be too nice for a manager. And obviously, the politicians, use of the emotional labour that goes between being a politician. The politician is somebody definitely has to be emotionally inauthentic. You can't show the fact that they're stressed. They can't. They've got to pretend that they know what's going on. They've got to pretend they know what they're doing. It's part of the job. And to conceal doubt. You can't really have a politician saying, well, I don't actually really know how I feel about this. They have to indicate that they are confident, because if they're not confident, then the electorate lose confidence in them. If you're talking about concealing emotion, how much more emotional labour can there be than being a soldier? Soldiers have to do a lot of concealing emotion. I mean, they have to be almost unreadable, don't they? To not be able to show fear, to not be able to show weakness, to not be able to show contempt for the commanding officers, even when the commanding officer is being a twat towards them. In addition to Marion Izat White's work on leadership as emotional labour, there's also a paper by Jens Ozin, which is on soldiers' work and emotions, and applies the concept of emotional labour to soldiers. Just reading from the abstract. The modern distinction between reason and emotion is still central to the feeling rules in many occupations, such as soldiers who are trained to overcome exhaustion and existential anxiety to function even under extreme and hostile conditions. Two cases will be discussed which show different strategies to deal with emotions. They illustrate the tensions between organisational and societal feeling rules. Firstly, the contradiction between the satisfaction of being efficient and reliable as a soldier and the feelings of guilt and shame that go along with breaking one of the strongest social taboos of the inviolability of life of others. Secondly, the contradiction between the public presentation of soldiering as highly honourable and the chaotic and brutish reality of combat. The article concludes with questions about the price soldiers and societies have to pay for training people to kill. In the introduction, substantial emotional management is not the sole preserve of women and the service industry as Hochschild originally assumed. It is also undertaken by male employees in male-dominated occupations and professions such as bouncers. Bouncers was an example I thought of. I mean, bouncers can't appear to be too friendly, can they? So they have to conceal their friendliness. They have to maintain a front of being formidable. Firefighters, rescue workers, and soldiers. However, the feeling rules in such occupations differ from the feeling rules typically applied in the female-dominated service industries. They focus more on controlling one's emotions than on shaping the emotions of others. Accordingly, emotion management of soldiers differs from Hochschild's assumption that it is mainly done as the public expression of a specific emotion to shape feelings in others, e.g. in customers to increase profit. Instead, the idea of rational warfare implies that soldiers are able to control their emotions, to follow orders under extreme conditions, and even to sacrifice their own life if operationally necessary. Therefore, soldiers are trained in controlling, suppressing, and channeling emotions such as fatigue, anxiety, and aggression in a way that is functional for a mission. And once you start including soldiers and leaders, there's not many feminists that would talk about how many female leaders we have, although actually we do have a great deal right now. Seems to be more all the time. But it's always implied that that politics is still a male-dominated industry. Being a soldier is still definitely a male-dominated industry. Firefighters and bouncers are both predominantly male. And these experience emotional labour too. Salesperson as well is not a role that's exclusively female. It requires a lot of surface acting, which is emotional labour. If you've done door-to-door sales, it is the most disheartening job ever, and you've got to keep being enthusiastic every time you meet a new customer. You've got to pretend you're enthusiastic all over again. Massively disheartening. Door-to-door sales is a job that you wouldn't consider to be exclusively female, would you? It is far more mixed in terms of gender than it used to be. Door-to-door sales used to be a very, very male industry. It's now more mixed. It's still not associated with a female job. There's a lot of emotional labour involved in that. I think what Hochschild did when she tried to claim that it's women that do emotional labour, it's not. What it is it's not the fact that women do more emotional labour. Actually, when it comes down to emotional labour, I think there are a lot of male-dominated industries, as I said, soldiers, politicians, door-to-door salesmen, police, bouncers, firefighters, all do emotional labour. It's not the emotional labour that keeps going to them. It's the being nice. It's the jobs in which one is expected to be lovely. Those are the jobs that are predominantly female, not the ones that involve the most emotional regulation, because there's emotional regulation in male-dominated industries too, but because of what the feminists would call benevolent sexism, the women is wonderful syndrome, those professions that require people to be lovely are predominantly female. And of course, that is the form of emotional regulation that actually gets the most immediate rewards. Because if you're acting lovely, you also kind of get loved. You don't get loved for acting formidable. You don't get loved for acting stoical. You get loved for being lovely. So, even though it is professional emotional labour, it is also getting the sort of benefits that you would also have in the unpaid emotional labour arena as well. Yeah, the fourth claim is that it is the fact that we undervalue emotional labour contributes to the gender wage gap. Now, obviously, this claim is not being made by those feminists who are completely idiotic and saying women are paid 77% to the dollar for the same damn job, because it can't be the same damn job if it's the ones that involve emotional labour and the ones that don't involve emotional labour getting paid more. It clearly is a different damn job. It's a different damn job. So the idea of those feminists who actually have a stronger argument is that it is the professions that are female dominated are lower paid than the professions that are male dominated. Now, as I've just demonstrated, there is emotional labour in male dominated jobs. So you're going to have to look elsewhere for the reason that female dominated jobs tend to be paid less. However, Karen Straughan has a good video suggesting why this might be and why women undervalue their own labour.
According to Catherine Hakim, I believe she's with the London School of Economics, when fields previously dominated by men are overrun with women, they lose status and the relative pay decreases. Now, the hangover might not be from some sense that women's work is worth less than men's work. The hangover might be from the fact that women understand they can rely on other sources of income, husbands, subsidies, etc., and therefore do not prioritize earnings and are therefore willing to work for less. Now, the graphic that Jim showed, and I'll put up a screenshot of it here, on part-time work, kind of demonstrates that. Obviously, men feel more pressure to work full-time than women do. Is it perhaps because men are pressured internally or externally to prioritize earnings while women are not? I'm reminded of a woman named Abby I used to work with. And I feel okay using her real name because this is like 25 years ago or more. She had a teaching degree in primary school education, but she was working as a barmaid at in the same high-end restaurant that I was. And I asked her why she wasn't teaching, and she kind of got this really dismissive look on her face and said, oh, I could get a teaching job if I'm willing to move to Kitimat or like 100 Mile House, but I shouldn't have to move into the middle of nowhere just to get a job. Now, I've also noticed another thing in my travels driving through the hinterlands of Alberta. Huge billboards in small farming communities advertising that they desperately need a veterinarian. Veterinary medicine has been dominated by women for a long time now, like decades. And there's a glut of vets in the city catering to people with cute little doggies and cute little cats. For people who need veterinary care for large animals and livestock, there's a massive shortage, and women vets, they just don't seem to be all that interested in moving to Nanton, Alberta, to shove their arms up cow vaginas or vaccinate pigs. Now, would this difference, whether it's cultural or biological that leads more women than men to choose part-time work, not also have an effect on the impulse to demand the highest compensation one could possibly get for one's work, or to endure unpleasant, difficult, or inconvenient conditions in order to get that higher compensation? If a male veterinarian is willing to move to Nanton, Alberta and shove his arm up cow vaginas while 80% of his colleagues are not, whether it's because cow vaginas are gross or whether it's because there's no decent nightclubs or shopping in Nanton, shouldn't he earn more money? Part of supply and demand includes the demands of employees for what they see as reasonable compensation. And if that's the case, would it not follow that once a field becomes dominated by a group of people who don't feel as much pressure to prioritize earnings, regardless of where that pressure comes from, wouldn't pay in that field tend to go down? Wouldn't it stand to reason that when a field becomes dominated by people who are willing to work as a bartender rather than a teacher, because being a teacher isn't worth the bother of moving, that the relative status of that career might undergo a decline? Now, Jim mentioned men's reactions to mechanization. When employers could replace skilled male workers with less costly female employees working at machines during the Industrial Revolution. Well, there were two things, not just one, that were going on there. Employers could save money in wages and increase productivity, and they would jump at any chance to do so. But in order for women to replace those male workers, women had to be willing or able to work for less pay than men did. Now, why would women be willing to do so? Perhaps this is one of those predispositions, or maybe a lack of a predisposition. Because when women entered the workforce, they had their husbands' paychecks covering the lion's share of the family expenses. I doubt any of them realized that by taking those jobs en masse, each of them were displacing some other woman's husband, and the woman next to her might be displacing her own. And both of them were actually endangering the very thing, his bigger paycheck, that allowed them to offer their own labor for less pay. I mean, remember, men railed against this situation while women cheered it on. Men lamented being displaced from well-paying jobs while women didn't lament. Maybe they lacked the foresight. Maybe they just couldn't envision what might happen. But they instead rushed in to work for less money. My husband still has a job. All I need is pin money. Until he doesn't have a job because the woman down the street offered to work for less than him because her husband has a job and all she needs is pin money. Until he doesn't have a job anymore because the woman 3 blocks over offered to work for less because her husband has a job and all she needs is pin money.
I can add some anecdotal evidence of my own to this. One of the things that we know is that the wage gap doesn't exist at all for the unmarried. In fact, by young I mean under 30, unmarried and never married people have the same wage, regardless of whether male or female. In fact, the female wage is slightly higher. What I noticed is I never really wanted to demand more pay as a single man, partly out of humility. I didn't really think I deserved more pay, and it always seemed greedy to ask for more pay. when I found myself in a situation where I was working in a profession where there had been no pay rise in something like 4 years, I started kicking up a fuss. And so I was saying, well, we should have had a pay rise by now. The cost of transport has increased twice a year over 4 years. So 8 times the cost of transport has increased, and our pay has not increased at all. I was a lone voice. And the reason I was a lone voice is because most of the people working there were dinkies. Double income, no kids yet. I was the only person there who was 1 income, 3 kids. So I didn't feel that I was being selfish for asking for more money, because I wasn't asking for more money for me. I was asking for more money for my wife and kids, who I was failing to support. Whereas everyone else was kind of like, why, you don't deserve more pay. We got a really good job. And the boss laughed at the suggestion that I should be demanding more pay. I wanted to punch him at the time. But I regulated my emotions as part of my job and didn't punch my boss. So there's this different pressure on a man who's a single breadwinner, and a single breadwinner is likely to be demanding more pay, whereas people that are not breadwinners perhaps feel that to demand more pay is a purely selfish thing to do. Secondly, I was working in a job where everyone was negotiating their own pay, and I had a few products that I was running through this company. When I say products, they were events that were run occasionally. I was trying to get better pay for everyone across the board, and the company were kind of pressing against that because they wanted to save money, until I eventually left the company in a sort of fit of pique. What I found was my products that were continuing to be rolled out by this company, they started employing female actresses in roles that had been previously male. Basically, I had a Sherlock Holmes product in which there was a Holmes character and a Watson character, and they replaced the Watson character, Mrs. Hudson. The reason they did this was because they could find an actress that worked for less money than an actor. So in fact, yes, a male was displaced out of the job because a woman worked for less. So yeah, it's happened. I've witnessed the wage gap firsthand. And it didn't happen because male labour is valued more. It happened because females value their labour less, because they know they can get money elsewhere. And all they're really after is pin money. So it may be that to continue having your labour valued, you have to stay in a male-dominated field in order to not be undercut by those who can work for less. It's a race to the bottom situation. Karen, being a libertarian, can't see any solution. I, being a socialist, can. Is better wage protections. We know what the protections are against race to the bottom, like economics. It's better wage protections, either through the state intervention of some sort of minimum wage structure, or unionisation and collective bargaining, which means that no one feels they are being selfish in asking for a pay rise because they're asking for a pay rise for everyone within that industry. Which leads me back to the long history of feminist derailings of socialism, for which I probably need to do another video another time. I had to look at this other Guardian article. The Guardian article, I've tried to talk about it, and every time I talk about it, I've gone off topic and I've gone onto a bit of a rant. And I've really got to praise it down. But basically, she does a lot of not talking about emotional labour, but talking about social secretary work. Things like remembering birthdays, which you go, okay, I suppose that's emotional labour in a sense. Remembering birthdays is emotional labour, especially if you don't really care about the person's birthday it is. You are having to pretend you care, so there's a labour there, right? Then again, I'm not sure why we should be congratulating anyone for being inauthentic. But she also talks about remembering where the spare keys are and knowing where the kitchen roll is, and things like that. There's nothing emotional about those things. Partly the reason why a guy doesn't know where things are in the house, it's 'cause it's not his house. It's your fucking house. You're the one that's there. You're the one that spends most time there. You're the one who's decided where everything goes. It's not his house. You're the one who organises everything. You're the one who has the little list come the weekend. Again, she's confusing organisational skills with emotional organisational skills with emotional labour skills. She does talk about some emotional labour things. She does talk about the idea that maybe women have to do extra emotional labour in workplaces. She goes all over the houses. That's why it's been so difficult to get through this freaking article. She also talks about girls flirting in waitress jobs and how if they're reliant on tips, they're less likely to report sexual harassment. Which again, it's going off a tangent. The reason this whole article took me off in tangents is because it keeps going off in tangents. I started talking about harassment in waitressing jobs, and I realised it's got nothing to do with emotional labour. Emotional labour referred to the flirting, I guess. She accuses men of one-track mindedness in the article. I think she says one-track mindedness. I don't think she's referring to the fact that he's talking, all he thinks about is sex. I think she's one-track mindedness. She means the fact that he can stick to the fucking topic. Because she clearly can't. You can see that. You can see that in the way this bloody article's organised. She can't stick to the bloody topic. And, which is why nor could I. And again, no, that's a skill. That's a skill. That's a skill that I don't fucking have. Right? As a dyspraxic person, I find it hard to stay focused on the goal. And I get drawn off into things. I get distracted. Your lack of one-track mindedness is not an asset. As she talks about Hillary Clinton getting coaching and told she's got to be friendly and chirpy and have a bit of heart, and she's putting that down to the fact Hillary Clinton's a woman rather than the fact that Hillary Clinton's a lizard. And Hillary, you have to convince people you're human. Gordon Brown got this as well. Gordon Brown got taught to smile. Have you seen Gordon Brown smile? Gordon Brown's smile is frightening. As a Chancellor's check, he was a very dour man. And as soon as he became Prime Minister, because Tony Blair realised, oh shit, I fucked the country up, so he did a runner. Take over being Prime Minister for me, will you, Gordon? And then, all right. And then they had to teach him to smile because they thought, oh well, no one's ever going to vote for a prime minister that can't smile, so they taught him to smile, and it kind of went like this. Because he's never had to do it before. Yeah. Anyway, so that's not a particularly Hillary thing. So I say it's not particularly a Hillary thing, not particularly a female thing. It's a politician thing. Politician is a job which I've already established. There's emotional labour in that job, but it's not a female-dominated job. See, this is how this article got me going off topic. It went off topic in so many directions. Then she has a thing about women faking orgasms. I don't know why. According to her, most women fake orgasms at least half the time. You never know. This is a whole 80s thing. It feels like a bit of research for an 80s thing. It's a 2011 study. And it's behind a paywall, so we can't see what the actual methodology is. I don't trust it. Seems like propaganda to me, and it seems like psychological warfare propaganda. So I remember this psychological warfare happening in the 80s. In the 80s, the feminists were very big on spreading the rumour that women don't have orgasms. And as far as I can tell, it's to undermine male self-esteem. Because what they're saying is, you know those women that pretend they like you? They're the ones who want to see you. It's us. Someone say it to your face, I truly hate you. All women hate you. We're honest about it. Other women? You know when you have sex with a woman, she goes, is that it? That's the woman that enjoys sex with you the most. Or the others. Faking it. They don't like you either. And that kind of like, oh, mind games. Psychological warfare. Horrible. Anyway, so she bangs on about that for a little bit. If you are faking orgasms, Yeah, that is being inauthentic. That is being emotionally inauthentic. And nobody wants it. Nobody wants that emotional inauthenticity. So whose benefit are you doing it for? Is what I'm going to say. For whom are you doing that? You're getting some sort of benefit out of it. It's what they claim, isn't it, that men are all potential rapists, but women have to fake their orgasms. Why? Why? If all men are potential rapists, we wouldn't care, would we? The fact that we care, the fact that, we'd quite like the idea that women are enjoying it too, would imply we're not all potential rapists, wouldn't it? But they haven't really thought that out. Okay, I'm going to read the last 3 paragraphs. The article had so many things that drove me mad and made me ranting. Anyway. The question remains, if we are socialized from a young age to be this way, is it possible that we really are better at it, even if nature did not make us so? Should we just shut up and get on with it because the world would stop turning if we didn't? Or is it time we started forgetting the birthdays too? Time we stopped falsely screaming ecstasy and demanded adequate formal remuneration for emotion work provided in the workplace as a skill. Now that right there would probably be a shake patriarchy to its core revolution. I've established there's a lot of emotional work done in the workplace that isn't done in female-dominated jobs. And actually far more stressful emotional labour. I do understand why emotional labour is stressful. I understand why there been a disconnect between the public face you're exhibiting and the inner self. The disconnect and dissonance between them causes stress. Lying causes stress. I've talked before about, when is Superman himself? Is he Superman himself when he's Superman or when he's Clark Kent? My son said when he's Clark Kent at home. Because he doesn't have to perform any emotional labour there. He doesn't have the emotional labour that Superman has of having to pretend to be invulnerable and confident and know what's going on. And he doesn't have the emotional labour that Clark Kent has of having to hide his power away and pretend that he's dimmer than he is, pretend to be a little more clueless than he is. He can get to be himself. He can sit there with all the insecurities that he probably has, the ones that he can admit to when he's Clark Kent, and at the same time he can probably use his laser vision to heat up chicken wings. No one need know. He can do that. He can be all of himself. What isn't going to stop turning? And no one wants you to fake your orgasms. Emotion work, provided in the workplace, is not specifically a female thing. Actually, I will add to this, because I did say this on one of my rants. Maybe my rants went off on bloody tangents, so it was so hard to put them together, edit them together into one thing. I'm an actor. And acting, talk about a job of emotional labour. There's a job of emotional labour, right? I have to create all sorts of inauthentic emotions. I'd say one advantage is, of course, I do a whole range of inauthentic emotions. I'm not getting emotional cramp by performing the same emotion over and over again. But it is exhausting. It is an exhausting job. You don't realise it's exhausting when you're doing it because you run on adrenaline and you don't realise it's exhausting until afterwards. And it's not well paid. You might think, there's actors that are well paid. You might think, Benedict Cumberbatch, he's well paid. Yeah, but he's not well paid for being an actor. He's really not well paid for being an actor. You get somebody acting in that role for much, much less than Benedict Cumberbatch. He's paid for being Benedict Cumberbatch. He's paid for being the man he is. Because he's a name. And once you're a name and you're famous, you're paid for being a name and famous, not paid for being an actor. But actors are not well paid. And you know why we're not well paid? Because we love it. Because it's really rewarding. And we love it. And we know we're always competing with people that do it for practically nothing. That's the thing. Jobs in which you have to be nice aren't well paid. because they're jobs that people like you for doing. The warning is, firstly, know what emotional labour is. Secondly, most of the feminists that will be bringing up emotional labour don't know what emotional labour is. They don't. So many articles I've read in which they've clearly demonstrated they don't know what emotional labour is. Emotional labour is having to present an inauthentic emotion as part of a job. Well, it is creating a disconnect between one's genuine emotional state and one's apparent emotional state, and the stress that's involved in dissonance between the two. And actually, when you realise that's what it is, you realise it's emotional regulation. There's no way you can claim that it's a predominantly female thing. Right, time to wrap up some conclusions then. Okay, so there are 4 claims regarding emotional labour. 2 of them regarded professional emotional labour, and 2 of them regarded unprofessional or unpaid emotional labour. The 4 claims were that 1, emotional labour is unpaid. There is such a thing as unpaid emotional labour. 2, that this is predominantly done by women. 3, that professional emotional labour was predominantly done by women. And 4, that it was the fact that emotional labour is undervalued that leads to it being underpaid. Okay, so taking those one at a time then. Firstly, you're talking about emotional labour being unpaid. I would say actually it has to be incentivised in some way, and either it's incentivised by a benefit, in which case it is paid, it's just not paid in monetary terms, or it's incentivised by the hope of a benefit, in which case it's sort of speculative emotional labour, hoping for a benefit. And I use the example of PUAs as people that are performing emotional labour in the hope of getting a benefit. Or it is incentivised with the threat of a punishment, and one could even call that emotional slave labour, if you like. Right, the second claim was it was predominantly women who do these. Now, I have to say, the emotional slave labour, which is actually predominantly to do with suppressing emotions, withholding emotions, rather than expressing them, tends to be something that is more expected of men. However, with unpaid emotional labour generally, I didn't think there was particularly much of a gender distinction, but I did think there was a gender distinction in who the emotional labour gets done for. I think the recipients of unpaid emotional labour do tend to be women. I also noticed in that section that a lot of the feminists that are using it don't seem to know what emotional labour means. You need to get them to find their terms. And they'll say, it's not my job to educate you. No, it's just as well. But you should at least educate yourself first. Anyway, that's beside the point. Maybe it is the point. Thirdly, emotional labour in professions. No, it's not emotional labour or emotional regulation that is predominantly female. It is being lovely that is predominantly female. Professions that require you to be lovely are predominantly female. Being lovely isn't the only form of emotional labour there is. And of the forms of emotional labour there are, being lovely are the ones that have the most rewards in terms of job satisfaction. Fourthly, there is a better reason given for the fact that professions that are female dominated are lower paid. It's to do with the fact that women do not see earning huge amounts of money a priority over job satisfaction. They'd rather say job satisfaction than big wages, especially if they know that they're getting financial support elsewhere. And this may also be why they're most attracted to those professions that have the reward of being lovely. So that's my 4 conclusions on the claims that are made about emotional labour. And I think that about wraps this essay up. It's been an essay, hasn't it? Of course, other opinions are available. This is just one blind man reporting on the nature of elephants. Cheerio. Alright, I had to ask myself, why does it bloody matter? So, one of the journalists that was writing about workplace emotional labour rather than home emotional labour, let's just mix the two together, is Rose Hackman, writing in The Guardian. At workplace, she's actually talking about extra things that women are expected to do in the workplace, rather than actually talking about what kind of jobs they do, which would make it kind of... Well, it's hard to say what they mean, because they kind of keep shifting what they mean, so you can't really chase it up. It's quite hard to pin it down. But she's talking about things that extra they do, like do the rip round for birthday cakes and things like that, which is kind of social secretary work that women take it upon themselves to do. I don't know, social secretary work, I know there's always a woman like that. Wherever you go, there's always a woman like that. I think it's a form of virtue signaling. I think they get a great reward from it, personal reward. Alright, this argument's key. So she's talking to one of her male friends while he's busying himself around his kitchen making us lunch. I don't really get it. What is emotional labour? One of my male friends asked me, busying around his kitchen making us lunch as we took a break from working together out of his Manhattan home. As I tried to break it down for my lunchtime cook, I saw his brows furrow in conversation and then slowly make way for confusion. My friend, a successful software engineer in his mid-30s, who had shown himself an ally to feminist causes in many of our past conversations, clearly thought this was a one step too far. Why is the fact that women provide emotional support work though? Why is the fact that women provide emotional support work though? There's definitely a missing word from that sentence. Otherwise, that sentence does not make sense. I think it's just have bad in the sentence. Why is the fact that women provide emotional support work bad though? What if people actually enjoy it? What if people are just better at doing that? Why do we have to make that something negative? His questions may have betrayed some exasperation with me. He had, in all fairness, prepared all of the meals we had shared during our New York friendship without ever complaining. Bastard! Why is complaining on these bits of emotional labour? It's always left to women to do. Isn't it time that men stepped up and started doing their fair share of complaining? There's a little bit of satire there. Anyway, I just added that bit for that. Why do you feminists always have to make normal things and issues to be debated? He continued. For him, framing emotional work as anything but natural was seen as needlessly picky. It was making something big out of something that was simply best left alone. My friend would probably never dare say, oh, but women are better cooks, women are more talented cleaners, or women are better with children. And yet, that he was suggesting that maybe some women are just like that, better at emotions, seemed to be the argument I was bumping into most frequently when I brought up the argument. Yeah, there's a reason you keep bumping into that frequently, because it's the most obvious thing to ask. And it's not saying women are like that, it's saying some women are like that. Not every woman I meet is a social secretary and has taken it upon herself to be a social secretary. However, I think probably about 1 in 10 women have just got a social secretary type brain. And, some men as well, maybe. And I think it's a personality type thing, not a gender thing. It was a personality type thing, it's not related to sex. So it's not even essentialist. I think it probably is something that women are socialised with. I'm not even sure it's good. I think it's a form of virtue signalling. And I don't think it's got anything to do with emotion either. You don't have to be emotional to remember a birthday. You don't have to be emotional to get a card. You just have to be like organising things. There's something almost OCD about it to me. This essentialist view doesn't hold up academically. In a 2005 seminal academic article on the subject, using data on 355 employed and married parents, it always, I tell you what, it always bothers me. I think, oh, so you're going to put a pound in for this? I can't eat. Right now, I'm struggling to feed myself. Yeah, I'll put a pound in. I'll put a pound in for somebody's fucking birthday card. God, they annoy me, actually. They bloody annoy me because they put guilt on everyone in the department. Everyone's going to put a bloody pound in. Doesn't matter how much they're struggling. Everyone's going to put a pound in, and then they're shamed if they don't. I bloody hate those people. Bloody hate those people that do the birthday cards thing. I never remember ever getting one. I never got a leaving card for anywhere because I normally leave in disgrace rather than. I bloody hate these people. Why should I care? Get rid of them. Get rid of those people that get leaving cards and inflatable bananas and stuff. Hate them. Hate them all.